Welcome to Oncology Today, Early Clinical Research Edition, a special program focused on drug development, early phase clinical trials, and the emerging role of B7-H3-Targeted Antibody-Drug Conjugates as an example. This is medical oncologist Dr. Neil Love, and for this program, I met with Dr. Manish Patel, the Director of Drug Development of the Florida Cancer Specialists, also known as FCS, in Sarasota, Florida. In addition to this interview, there's also a corresponding video program featuring Dr. Patel's slide presentation on clinical data involving the B7-H3 targeted antibody-drug conjugates. To begin, Dr. Patel commented on his career focus and work with the FCS.
I see myself as a drug developer, right? And so I'm a medical oncologist, hematologist, board certified in both. I see all cancers, but 100% of the patients that I see are on clinical trials. So I oversee our early phase drug development program. So I PI a good number of our phase 1 trials. I direct our whole phase 1 program. And we have 3 phase 1 units within our program, and I oversee them. We started off just in Sarasota, where I am, and then we've grown it over the years, 13, 14 years, and we've got a pretty large phase 1 program. So all the patients that I see, I'm fortunate, I'm a clinical researcher, and all the patients I see are on trial. So I see all solid tumors and heme malignancies.
So you really don't have primary care of these patients. You're seeing them specifically for the trial, and they are continuing with their primary doc.
All their care is conducted by us in our group in the early phase trial unit. So if, for example, if I'm the physician taking care of them, once they enter the trial, I take care of them while they're on the trial. So there are some things that we do locally to help the patients out, right? Whether it's labs or scans or supportive care, but all the treatment related visits and all the trial recorded visits for sure have to happen at our unit. And so and we handle almost all the care because as you know, on these early phase trials there's a lot involved and the patients are need a lot of attention, so we take care of all that. So yeah, all the patients I see are on trial. If they have other visits that they need locally, they can we arrange that, but we take care of almost all their care while they're on trial.
And basically all the patients that you're managing are patients of FCS physicians?
Great question. So we're open, right? So we're open to the country, to the world. As you know, patients are much more educated nowadays and have much more access on finding treatment options and trials. And so we do have patients from outside the state, from outside the country. A lot of interesting targets. The field is moving so quickly that people want to participate in some of these trials, especially with early promising results, right? And so I would say about 90% of our patients are from within our practice just because we hear about more of those patients. But it doesn't mean that we don't hear about patients from all over and including other centers within Florida. Mm-hmm.
Actually, it sounds like it must be a very interesting practice if you have these patients are being managed, then they come in, and as you say, now you're you have to kind of get involved in a primary way, managing them, and then I guess most of them end up leaving or going to another trial, but it sounds like a challenging situation, interesting situation for you in terms of the situations that you're seeing. Any thoughts about the type of trials that are being done now compared to 10 or 15 years ago? People on the outside like us, we look at this and clearly industry is getting much more involved than they were 10, 15 years ago. But I'm not sure exactly in what way. It seems like they're more involved with the common tumors, not so much with uncommon. I'm just kind of curious how you've seen that evolve, the industry, academic, sort of collaboration or research endeavors over the last 10, 15 years. It seems like a lot more industry now.
That's a great point. You're spot on. The field has evolved. It's become much more sophisticated, which is great, right, in terms of access to therapies and just tolerability and science, and that's how we move things quicker. in terms of the type of trials, clearly the focus is taken away from the chemotherapeutic type of drugs. Right now, we have a lot more targeted therapies, after going after certain mutations, actionable mutations. Of course, the antibody-drug conjugate field has taken off, and of course, the biggest field is immunotherapy. And so, there's a lot more activity in those versus what we used to do 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago, right? So and then the care with those type of drugs is at a different level, right? So when it comes to immunotherapy, as you know, bispecific antibodies, BiTEs, right, CAR T trials, all of that require a lot more attention, a lot more involvement of clinical trial units, especially on the early phase side, where we're establishing management, dosing, side effects, and so on. So there's a lot more involvement, a lot more hospitalization. We're going backwards in time. Remember, we used to hospitalize most of these patients and a lot of the therapies, and now we went away from it. A lot of the drugs were given in an outpatient setting, and now we're kind of going back in the last 6-7 years, going back to the hospital for hospital observation. So there's a component of that on the trials now, where we're observing patients afterwards for safety and cytokine release syndrome. So that's different than the past. And then you're right about the industry versus investigator-initiated trials, right? That used to be a decent part of the trials that were out there, investigator-initiated trials, but there was so much activity going on within the pharmaceutical company, within pharmaceutical arena around the world, in terms of the number of new drugs that are being investigated. There's so many opportunities, so many drugs that a lot of a good bulk of the trial menu at every center sponsor trials.
Another thing, and we've realized actually that when we do CME programs, up to 30% of the docs who are attending have been in oncology less than 10 years. A lot of them, less than 5 years. And they really don't realize how much things have changed and how quickly. The other thing that it seems to me is occurring, and I think there's probably data on this, is that I think phase 1 trials 10 or 15 years ago, usually the chance that a patient would actually benefit was pretty unlikely. Whereas now it seems like it happens a lot. Any thoughts about that and the fact that, yes, you want to try to help future generations of patients, but a lot of patients benefit themselves from being in trials?
Absolutely, and as you know, there are multiple benefits of these type of trials, and the field has advanced so much, and so much is known about these targets and how to make drugs, and just the sophistication of those in the pharmaceutical companies, scientists, clinicians, that the drugs are more pure, and a lot of hard work has been put in over several decades to get us to where we are now. And so you're right. We go into a lot of these early phase trials with a lot more expectations on efficacy, not only on the clinician side, right, patient side, but also on the pharmaceutical company side, right, on the industry side. Where before, I mean, what's really interesting is before we would directly go from dose escalation cohorts right into expansion for these phase 1 trials or into a phase 2 trial, right? And now a lot of the decisions on even going to an expansion phase or a phase 2 trial, for example, is based on efficacy from what the goals were from the dose escalation. So a lot of the expectations are much higher now, because of the successes that we're seeing on some of these early phase trials. And as you know, several drugs have been approved off of some of the phase 1 trials that became large in expansion phase. And so it's rewarding to be on this end of it, right, where we're taking care of these patients and helping develop these drugs, and seeing the number of advancements that are being made with these drugs. So I particularly enjoy, this is a great time to be part of drug development, phase 1 clinical trial work. But yeah, that's relayed to the patients. They one of the biggest questions they have is, what's been seen, what is the field showing with this target, with this drug, and the good thing now is there's a lot of companies that have come out with drugs that will be a little different, but the same target, right? Or it could be the same target, they just done it better. And so there's a little bit more data now than what we had many years ago on these targets and what to expect. And the patients are just seeing that, right? There's so many drugs that are being approved right? You've seen the number that have been approved in the last 5-10 years. They see that, they sense it, and they know that the field is moving very quickly, and they know to get access to these drugs, they have one of the main ways to get access to these drugs is on these early phase trials. And while there's patients who've had their cancers for double digit number of years, and while they've been getting treated for those cancers, they see approval after approval coming, and they've seen the results of these trials and where they started. Just pembrolizumab alone, right? Just that phase 1 trial alone, right, really changed things. So, yeah, it's definitely helped the discussions and really led to a takeoff in the number of phase 1 trials being conducted and who's participating, right?
I'm also curious about some of the trends related to regulatory issues in the FDA. We can kind of get into that, but just to mention, though, that relevant to this issue of potential benefiting from being involved with research, we did actually a video presentation. I use videos rather than slides for FLASCO, Florida, Society of Clinical Oncology, on disparities in oncology care and clinical trial accrual. And one of the videos was a patient with myeloma who'd been doing great on teclistamab for a year and a half. And I interviewed him that day I interviewed him was the day it was approved.
Yeah.
So he had been doing great
amazing.
for a year and a half the day it was approved, and I couldn't come up with it. And that kind of also, I mean, we're not experts in disparities, but, I hear things, so I'm just kind of curious. I know there's some kind of initiative coming out of the FDA involving disparities, like you need a, quote, disparity plan or something. I don't know if that applies to phase 1 as well as other later phase. What is the FDA starting to do in terms of that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. It's a big focus of all early phase, late phase, because the continuum. These trials just go very quickly from one to the other, and so the companies, industry have to have a plan very early on what they're going to do to address diversity, right, and disparities. So we're asked in the very beginning, what are the plans? Each site is evaluated now when groups are being considered for particular trials. What is your plan with diversity and being able to enroll different populations? So we have to answer those questions from the site end as well. So the sites have to have a plan on access to these trials, to those populations. But of course, the pharmaceutical companies, as you mentioned, a little tougher for them because they're directly answering to the FDA on what they've done and what their plans are to address it, even on an early phase trial end.
I'll share with you, you may know this, but something that Paul Richardson from Dana-Farber discussed on a program we had. Actually, it was last summer, and then they presented this at ASH related to, I don't know if you remember the big determination trial looking at transplant and myeloma, where they saw that African American people didn't seem to benefit. And then they presented some stuff at ASH that maybe there's even a biologic basis with the Duffy-Nil thing, or I don't know, sort of where that went. But the thing that was interesting was that they got, I think 19% of the patients were African American. And I said, what was your secret? How did you do it? And he said, African American oncologists, which I thought was very interesting. He even follows them when they move. So I thought it was interesting that angle to get the doc to be in the minority. I don't know if that's a strategy that you've used or thought about.
Wow, yeah, that's so tough. To be able to recruit physicians that way, that's and also, as you can imagine, taking care of patients and changing doctors to do that is very difficult. We try our best. I mean, every site does in the country in remembering this, and it's a big initiative from the sponsors' end. So we make it a point as well to constantly address it, and within our practices, we advertise and make it open. I mean, the good thing about our group is that we have pretty good diversity just in Florida alone, right? And as you know, so it helps us with that. But I can imagine around the other parts of the country that it's even more difficult. Luckily nowadays there's a little bit more access to things that used to prohibit groups from enrolling in the trials. So no matter just distance alone, right? Before it would be sometimes a little bit more difficult for things to be covered for patients to participate in trials, and now travel is generally covered for most trials, and pharmaceutical companies, I think it's because of this initiative, they realize that has to be in place. Translation of consent forms really important to have that planned ahead of time. There was a time, it depends where you are in the country, depending on what populations you see, you may not have wanted to arrange when they ask you up front, do you need translations of certain consents? And there's a lot of places in the country that would say, no, we don't need it. But now, as things have gotten faster with that process, most sites should be pushing for that right up front, so you don't have delays in getting certain populations on trials. So these are all things that are now in place that hopefully we're going to see the fruits of this down the road, and more data. Like you said, there's you always wonder if certain populations benefit from certain therapies more, and why. Right? You know, why are some toxicities? We've always had this interest in Asia versus the Western part of the world on why toxicities are different. Well, let's prove it on these trials, right?
I also wanted to ask you a little bit about what's going on in terms of the FDA in terms of a dosing, because I was mentioning this paper. I guess there's a guidelines that came out of ESMO phase 1 study, the MDIC, talking. But I've been hearing a lot about dosing, even post approval. Like for example, like in breast cancer, dose modification in the adjuvant setting to be able to keep people on, abema or whatever. And I hear more and more emphasis on dose, post-marketing dose. What is the FDA kind of mandating to sort of get ahead of that? It seems like that's what they're trying to do.
Right. And as you've noticed over the years, we often find out as these trials progress, and even after drug is approved, we realize sometimes that the dose may not have been solidified properly early on, right? And or the schedule, and so because of all the years of experience on how people actually dose a drug versus how it's part of the label, has led to a big concentration on really trying to get it done right. Trying to get the dose right early on, and I support it. There's a lot more work involved in what the designs are nowadays or in the future. But basically, before, once the MTD was reached in these early phase trials, and the dose was established, all patients would just get that in the expansion phases, go on to phase 2, phase 3 trials, and the drug would get approved. Right, that would be the process. And those are based off small numbers in the phase 1 trials, right? I mean, the 3x3 traditional phase 1 design, you have 3 or 6 patients who clear a dose, and you may go with that dose going into a large trial, right? And you find out later that it may actually be needed to be lower or higher, right? And so now, because of this Project Optimus, that the FDA has initiated, what's being done now is going into the expansion phases, or at the end of once the doses are established at the end of dose escalation in phase 1 trials. Now there's randomizations that are involved where you're pretty much having to study 2 doses instead of just going with one with a bulk of patients. Let's look at 2 doses from what you've learned in the trial, and enroll a good number of patients in 2. And so that more information, more data is obtained, and that will help future trials. So that does mean that trials will, especially phase 1 trials, will last a little longer. There'll be more enrollment, more work is going to need to be placed, right? More infrastructure. The demand on moving things faster will have to slow down a little bit, right? But I think in the end, for the good of the field, I think the doses will be established better, and it'll be better for patients.
One of the questions I wonder about is there enough room for innovation in oncology research nowadays? Are we so slotted into this paradigm that we have, targeted therapy, immunotherapy, all the economics behind it? Are we leaving enough room for, the creative geniuses or, people with interesting ideas to get them bedded?
Yeah, it's a great point. I've often wondered the same thing, right? Especially in the immunotherapy world, people get fixated on certain pathways that we have to somehow make this an immune type of therapy. We have to have that angle for this to go anywhere. And you forget that there's so much untapped potential with other targets, things that we don't even know about. And if we put our resources and our efforts towards those pathways, those fields, we actually may come out a little further ahead, right? But as you know, once a certain field takes off, everybody wants to be in it, right? And that's kind of where we're at with, for example, immunotherapy. Yeah, there's a lot of pressure within the pharmaceutical, with funding for them, right? That's a big deal, and they're closing trials earlier now than they have in the past, and they need home runs early. They need some winners and some data efficacy early. And so when the field is very popular, very hot, you want to get in that because you think that gives you the highest chances of succeeding. But there's a lot of untapped areas in oncology, especially with the targeted. The targeted therapy is so rewarding on the clinical research side, right? When you find that, even if it's a rare mutation, when you find some of these things with low incidences and patients can really respond to these drugs, right? What other targets are we missing in our long NGS panels that we get, right? What other targets are we not making drugs for, and why, right? We have a lot of smart people out there, a lot of resources.
So the other thing I was curious about is the issue of involving referring doctors in this process. As you mentioned, you're focused on the FCS docs, which is great. And incidentally, I don't know, how many other phase one units are there like that with the volume? How many
Right.
trials are you actually running right now?
Right. So we have a pretty large program. So we have about over 100 phase ones that are running at one time within our practice. The bulk of them are over here where I'm at. But we also have a phase two, phase three program at the same time. So at any one given time, we have a couple of hundred trials running at once, and just phase one triple digits. Yeah, it has its challenges, right? You're right. We're probably one of the few in the country that has this set up in a large practice. There are others that focus on phase one around the country, that work with practices, ones that are embedded in the practice, and especially a physician owned. I think we're it. And so it does have its benefits and its challenges, right? I mean, obviously, our doc physician owned practice, our docs are heavily invested in patient care, and we're even though we have 200 over 200 physicians in our practice, we communicate very closely, believe it or not, about patient care, and it does help to have that involvement, that interest on making things go well within a group, because you hear about more patients, and patients like the fact that they stay in the same practice, right? The EMR, their scheduling, nurses, just the process. There's not a loss of information when people go to a center to to participate in a trial from another office. As you know, around the country, there's sometimes a loss of information or some inefficiency there, right? Where you have to now get records, or you have to find out if you have this mutation or not. If it's in the same group, we have access to everything, right? Our charting is the same, so that does improve the efficiency of getting patients on trial, but also care. At the end of the day, you don't have a loss of information, so you can pick in the right treatment for the patient, and they don't lose the group that's been working with them for so many years. And patients like that. And what I like about our setup also is that we can order. It's the same system, so I can order things on patients locally, within their own practice while they're on trial with
Right.
me, maybe 3, 6, 7 hours away in the same state, and they can get their scans locally. There's a lot of things that we can do in their existing office, whereas in other centers around the country, they kind of have to do everything at that center, and it's very difficult for patients, especially the travel, right? So within the state, you can get to with the longest that patients have to travel are 6, 7 hours. Everything else, so but the bulk of our patients are within 2, 3 hours. The most of the patients that we enroll on trial, and we have a multiple phase one units now, so patients are able to get to these centers quicker, more efficiently, and their care is better.
I was just flashing on how successful it is in Germany to get people in trial. Like all their patients go on trial. They get trials done just in Germany. It's like maybe Florida is going to become like Germany, where you get a
Yeah, I
high
hope so.
fraction of people on trial.
That'd be
Well,
awesome.
I mean, no, I
Yeah.
mean, really, my point is there's an advantage when you can concentrate on a smaller area. And that
Hmm.
really, and you also, of course, are doing, involved with phase 2, phase 3 trials. You have Brad Monk that you just brought in, so you have a whole,
Hmm.
plethora of later line trials. How, at this point, globally, how effective you think you have been, or the system has been, in making these physicians aware of appropriate opportunities, or are they just so flooded with stuff that they can't keep, literally, that they really rarely can keep up with it and miss a lot of great opportunities?
Great question. So yeah, as every year that goes by, more and more drugs are get approved, and it's harder just to keep up with the commercially available drugs, right? But the advantage that we have is, we educate as much as we can on all these mechanisms, these drugs, and what to what's allowed, what's been seen with those drugs, and I think, and we have regular meetings within the practice where we have a research component, so docs get their education that way. But when you see your patient on a trial, let's say with us in our phase 1 unit, we update our docs every step of the way. Every scan, we're updating the referring physicians on how that patient's doing. And when you see responses, the first question that that referring doc may have in their head is why? What's so neat about this mechanism? What are you seeing? And those are the conversations we have. And there's things that we explain up front anyways when we open up a new trial, and everybody knows our trial menu, but we try to educate as much as we can on mechanisms and why certain. And so the more patients you refer to some of these trials, the more you learn. It becomes repetitive, right? And
Right.
it's been great to see a lot of the drugs that we've worked on in the phase 1 trials, especially the first in man trials, eventually get approved. And I've been very fortunate to see that process happen on double-digit number of drugs, and it's been very rewarding. And when the docs will remember that, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, that's that trial that you had 7 years ago, and I remember my patient on that," and that it sticks in their head that that patient's still in CR, right? And they remember that, and I remember our docs, our early phase docs, make it a point to remind them of that. So when these drugs are just are about to get approved or are approved, we'll point out to our docs, "Hey, you had." We'll call out the docs that referred patients to that drug once it got approved. You were part of that early process of getting the drug approved. So it is rewarding, but they remember it. And as you know, when patients and when docs when physicians enroll or see their patients on a trial with a particular drug, once that drug gets approved, if you had enough experience with that drug, you're more likely to use that drug. If there's other similar drugs, you're more likely to go with the one that you did a lot of work with, right? Just from a comfort standpoint, right? And that exists on the standard of care side. You always go with the regimen that you're most comfortable with, right? And so that same thing happens when the drug gets approved. That experience of seeing your patients on these trials, even including patients who get referred to our unit, helps them when the drug comes out. And then we try to educate when the drug comes out. This is our experience. Hey, this drug causes QT prolongation. You just be careful, watch the EKGs, or this is how we manage the nausea with this drug early on when we're creating the management guidelines, right? And little tricks, and that helps. So it does improve the quality of the practice. Not only even if the drug doesn't get approved, right? What's out there?
Yeah, I think I saw some early work you were involved with the pertobrutinib.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, we did that initial phase 1.
I mean,
Yeah, it
that's
was
one of my
rewarding. Where
favorite topics. Such a
Yeah,
cool
oh,
drug.
absolutely, absolutely. We were one of the first 2 sites to open that phase 1 trial, and I had many, many patients on that over during the course of the phase 1. They're still with me now, still responding very nicely. An amazing field in CLL and indolent lymphoma, despite having other therapies that came about, before it, just with a little change in the structure, right?
Really, really amazing. So one more thing just to mention, then we'll get down to the other stuff in terms of informing physicians. I thought I'd tell you about an experiment we did last week. in a webinar. We had Andy Evans and Sonali Smith talking about lymphomas, our year in review series. And one of the things they wanted to talk about, they have this new trial, phase 3 trial, limited stage Hodgkin. They're trying to decrease intensity, less chemo, less radiation. They're bringing in Nevo, all, et cetera, et cetera. But so I said, well, let's do an experiment in the webinar. So we did this experiment. First of all, we polled the audience and we said, have you ever heard of this study? You know anything about it? 85% of people said no. And then we spent 5 minutes talking about it. That's it. Just the two of them verbally. We hardly used any slides. They just explained the purpose for the study and why they did it. Then we went back and polled them again, and 88% of the docs said, yeah, I'd put a patient on that study. So it's,
Right.
I found it interesting that, a certain, and if you get the right combination of content, highly respected people, they've just spent the whole hour, they know what they're talking about, who present something in a clear, concise way. And in just, 3 or 4 minutes, we had 88 docs ready to put people on trials. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, the last, as you know, post-COVID, there's a lot more remote, virtual work that's being done, education, and we have lost a little bit in terms of interest. You can see that, and just knowledge. And sometimes these in-person meetings, and you do a great job of this, the in-person meetings, you get a lot more accomplished, a lot more to learn, but the resources for that and the opportunities for that are less now than they were in the past. So that is a little downside of a lot of the virtual work that's being done out there, including trial enrollment. And so every center has to deal with that, where we're trying to educate physicians out there that there's a great trial that's available, and we're doing it via email mainly, right? Especially when you're trying to cast a broad net. Even if you participate in tumor boards, it'll be virtual because you're 6-7 hours away. But in the past, when we did it in person, and when we have our meeting in Orlando that with you, and we do all this at a different time after your session, and we do it. We go up at the podium. Next day, we hear about, hey, we have this patient for that trial. Well, we said the same thing last week on via email. We didn't hear anything, right? So in person is so important.